Okay, today we are going to learn how to make cork terrain bases. And by cork terrain bases, I mean, not really bases, but more little bits of scatter terrain. You can use this for basing models as well, hoping the focus works well on these. But basically little bits of scatter terrain. Let me grab a example to show you. Works really well with like a little objective markers. This is a little Tau Empire objective marker I put together, but you can see it really blends in well with the other bits of scatter terrain. So you're going to need a couple of things. The first thing you're going to need is cork. I usually buy these 1 foot by 1 foot cork tiles. They usually come 4 to a pack. It's about $8. You can buy them at pretty much any soft office supply place. Amazon.com sells them. I usually get mine at Staples or Michael's or Kmart. Pretty much anywhere. You can also buy them in smaller. How much is this? 6 inch by 6 inch. And you can use the corners of these to do sort of like staggered steps. Steps work well. So what I do is I take a piece of, this is medium density fiberboard. It's also called MDF. You can get it in any hardware store. My father-in-law has a nice little jigsaw that I use to cut these out into random pieces. You could use literally anything. You could use a CD. You could use a piece of cardboard. You could use anything that's relatively solid. The idea is just to give a solid base. So tear the cork into random pieces and super glue it on. You can make small hills. You can make medium-sized hills. You can make large hills. You know, you can do big flat areas. And then on this surface, you want to just use PVA glue and glue on some sand. Usually, instead of spending the fairly expensive money on hobby sand, I'll just go to like a dollar store or like an art and supply craft place. You can usually get some variable grit sand for pretty cheap, a couple bucks. If you're just looking for texture, your best bet is to go to a hardware store and get playground sand. Usually I think it's like $3 for 50 pounds, which you will never use in the entire life of doing hobbies. 50 pounds of sand is a lot. So once you glue the sand on, go ahead and prime the piece. And this is what it should look like. I've got a big flat surface of cork with a little bit of pieces. I want to make sure that models can stand on here. You don't want to make it too busy or else it's not really useful as difficult terrain. And you can see the, hopefully, variable grit on the sand. Some pieces are bigger than others. Gives you a nice little bit of texture. It's also going to make it look nicer when we paint it. So, first things first. Got 3 paints. I'm using these folk art paints. If you go to any art supply place, you'll see these. These are not good for painting models. The pigment is way too large, which means it'll look sort of chalky on your models. It's real hard to thin down to a point where it's useful. But I'm using 3 colors. I'm using coffee bean, which is roughly equivalent, and I'm going to use the old colors because I don't know. Well, I'll use old and new. This is roughly equivalent to Rhinox hide, Games Workshop Rhinox hide. I'm also using yellow ochre, which is roughly equivalent. I actually have a paint chart right in front of me here. Roughly equivalent to whichever the color they use for the Tau bases. Averland Sunset. This is roughly equivalent to Averland Sunset, maybe a little bit darker. And I use vanilla, French vanilla. It's weird. Yeah, French vanilla, which is roughly equivalent to, basically like a bleached bone or screaming skull, I guess it would be called now. But essentially what you want is brown to yellow to tan. You can also do brown to tan to white, but I think the yellow, and this is going to depend where you live, but if you actually go out and get on your hands and knees and look at the ground, you'll see your dark shadows. This will be sort of like, the kind of roots of grass, and then this is your highlight color. Looks really good with sort of static grass on top of it. So let's get started. So be sure to paint, mix your paint well. So I'm going to use a large dry brush to do this. All you really need to do is kind of get like a nice blob on there. Not a whole lot. It comes out. You can see like it is not fluid at all. It is very gloppy. It barely slides, but does the job. So large GW dry brush. I think they used to call these tank brushes. You can actually go to any hobby supply store and get really cheap brushes. We're almost going to do an overbrush here, so I want to wipe off some of the paint, but not all of the paint. And then as you're going, and I'm going to do a little bit of this and then hold it up to the camera so that you can see. Okay, so hopefully you can see like I'm not covering it. It's not a full coverage, but it's a fair amount of paint. So it's more than a dry brush, less than a base coat. And you want your brush to be fairly dry, but not totally dry. This should not take very long, so I'm just going to keep talking. And if you get too much in one area, like a streaky, too much, and you think, oh my God, this is terrible, you can kind of wipe it off. You have a little bit of time before it dries, but you can also just use that little area to put static grass. Static grass is magic for this because it covers up, get a better angle here, covers up just about all of the mistakes you make. So, you just don't have to worry too much about it. I get a little bit more, not too much. And with the rocks, you just kind of want to drag your brush over top of it. And again, you don't want to get too much paint, but you want to get enough that you look at the thing and you go, man, it's definitely like dark brown, but you don't want to have any solid patches of brown. You want it to really be in the background. So let me do this, and I'm going to wash this sucker off. Oh, my paint. Okay, let me wash this off here. So normally you would want to wait for the brush to 100% completely dry. For the purposes of this tutorial, and because I have lots of supplies here, I actually have 2 more clean brushes that I'm going to use. So first stage. I know it just kind of looks black, but if you can kind of see, there's definitely brown all over it, but there's still black in the cracks. Next stage is going to be the yellow ochre. Shake it real well. And same thing. Just get a nice blob. You're not going to use nearly as much. This size, these things are like $1.50, maybe $2.50, $2.50. They will last just until the end of time. So you don't really need a whole lot. Now for this one, we want to do more of a real dry brush. So make sure the brush isn't too heavy. When I do this, to make sure I avoid streaks, I usually start with the rocks and just barely drag it over, and that's what you should be seeing. If you can see, the one area is lighter, but it's still like brown and black. So do that. Do that across the entirety of the rocks. And I'm going to show you what it looks like when you've just done the rocks, because I want you to get a good view of, what a difference it makes. Okay, so there you go. That's kind of what it looks like there. Now I want to do the cork areas. Again, make sure that, you're loading up the brush, but you want, okay, so watch this. You go like that. Ooh, ooh, ooh. There we go. See how it's like, you can see the yellow on there, but it's real streaky and dry looking. That's the consistency you're looking for. and then just go through. Very careful not to do too many like heavy brush strokes because you want to build it up. And make sure you get the edges of the cork because the edges are really going to pick up the light, and it's what makes the train look nice on the table. Remember, you don't want it to look necessarily accurate to real life. You want to make it look really awesome from like 3 feet away. Because if it looks awesome from 3 feet away, people will say, damn, that's a nice looking table. If you're looking for really like accurate, it's not going to do the trick. So you can kind of see there, the cork has now got kind of a yellow tone to it a little bit, but it's still definitely brown, dark tones. This area is, it's trick of the shadow. It's actually a little bit brighter. So let me wash this brush off. Okay. Again, if you are using one brush, make sure it dries completely. I tend to go like this, you know, rub it off, but make sure it dries completely. Also, if you're doing, you know, multiple pieces of train, I'm only doing one today. But if you're doing multiple pieces, you're just going to go from piece to piece to piece. Now we go to our French vanilla folk art. Shake it up really well. Okay. Little dry crusties drop off the pop here sometimes. Boop, boop, boop. You need even less this time. So again, I'm going to load up my brush. I'm going to make sure it gets wiped off nice and well. Not totally dry. Again, we're working with terrain, so it's not as important as it would be with a model. But again, I'm going to start, and I'm going to very carefully just kind of drag my brush very lightly over the rock areas. So, if you can see there, you know, this area here versus the rest of the areas, you're definitely getting the white tone on the top. You can still kind of see the yellow through. But the white is going to be your real ultimate highlight color. So again, I'm just going to go through, kind of do the rocky bits. And you can glue some extra like sand and stuff up here if you're just looking for more texture. One thing I really like about the cork is that the cork actually has a built-in texture. So it's going to pick up the paint. And then I just kind of dry brush over top. And that's working pretty well. Okay, so you can see now you've got, you're basically looking at 4 colors. You've got the black undertone, the dark brown, a little bit of yellow, and then the white highlight. There's one last stage I like to do, because if you see the very edges of the cork, and I know the highlighting's a little weird, but there's a little buildup of white, but not much. So what we're going to do to make this really pop, again, get a little bit more of the French vanilla. And then, I think I brought it too much. Okay, and then on the edges, you want to kind of like build it up. So what I do is I pull the brush towards me from the edge of the surface. And what that's going to do is it's going to kind of build up. I can kind of show you. See how it's creating, like this area I'm not touching. It's exactly the same. But right here, it's really changing, and that's weird. Okay, focus. It's really changing and getting a much crisper, much nicer look. So when you look at it from several feet away, it's going to really, 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 really pop. And just do that. Do it on the raised bits too. It I find makes a huge difference. You know, and it's also depends on what you like. Now, if you're going to be doing this with sort of your standard kind of, let me clean this off. So your standard kind of ground area, you're going to want to use again like the kind of a brown and ochre yellow and a kind of bone tan color. If you're doing like a, I don't know, like a Martian landscape, you might want to use instead something like something like this kind of set up, like a, you know, again, a brown to a red to sort of, I don't know, this is tau light ochre, corn red, and Rhinox hide. That actually looks really good for Martian terrain versus, just to show you, regular ground. This is going to be brighter. This is going to be darker. You can experiment with it. The nice thing about Cork is it's fairly cheap. So if you do, if you kind of mess up and do something wrong, it doesn't really matter. You can always just prime it black again. So this is in a pretty good position. The last thing we're going to do is go ahead and glue a little bit of static grass on. Now, for static grass, I'm just using literally Games Workshop standard static grass. There's nothing fancy to it. PVA glue, which is some people call Elmer's glue. It's just white glue. I get this stuff at the dollar store because it's 50 cents, and glue is glue for the most part. And what you're going to want to do, usually with these terrain pieces, and this works for 25 mil bases, 40 mil bases, you know, 60 mil bases, whatever. I use what I think of as the rule of three. So you want 3 big blobs. So I've got, let's see, I got a brush here. So I'm just going to use a standard base coat brush for this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my sand. I don't have any areas that are really like, I really overdid in terms of putting way too much paint on. Like if I had a big streak, actually, kind of, yeah, if I had a big streak, I could say there was a big streak here. What you'd want to do is kind of just use, you know, put your glue there, right? You can see I'm just kind of blobbing it on here right now. And again, what I mean by the rule of 3 is if you want it to look realistic, have sort of like 3, and I'm going to have this kind of go up here a little bit, you know, up on top of the cork. You want 3 blobs. 3 blobs of static grass looks realistic. If you have more than 3 blobs of static grass, it generally does not look very realistic. I don't know why, but, you know, reality of the situation, that's what happens. So I got my glue on. I want to kind of smush it around, make sure I cover that area real well. You know, you can see all I'm really doing is just kind of smoothing it out. Yeah, kind of smooth it out a little bit. Make sure I don't get any on the side, on the rim. I got a little bit, so I can wipe it off. And then lastly, okay, make sure you wipe your brush off right away. That sound is my water pot, my nice chaos water pot. So I did that. Get your grass. Now, one thing that I do with the static grass to make my life a heck of a lot easier when it comes time to clean up is go ahead and, you know, put down a napkin or something. Paper towel works. I was actually out of paper towel, so I use napkins. A little bit of static grass. You know, just sprinkle it on. Different people have different methods of doing this. I find sprinkling it works fine. And then tap it off. And then you want to kind of blow like up and underneath, right? A little bit of grass. It's really bright right now, but that's because the white glue underneath hasn't dried yet. When the white glue underneath dries, it'll be significantly darker and it'll look great. Okay. Tap, tap, tap. And the last little bit here. Okay. Tap, 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 tap. Okay, I just blew off all the excess. And then you can take this and right back in there. Now this goes in the trash right away. And totally lost my lid. Oh, whatever. I'll figure out where the lid went. And that's pretty much that. You can see it's going to look a little bit different because I used the MDF base that has the sand glued to it, whereas this one has no sand glued to it at all. So it kind of depends on what look you're looking for. I prefer these just because I like the fact that they're very rigid, they're flat. These can kind of flex a little bit. That's actually what the cork looks like, but these can flex a little bit, so you know, depends on what you're looking for. But if you base your models the same way, it actually looks, you know, it just looks nice. It gives you a little bits of scatter train. You can do this for larger pieces as well. Base your models the same way. Base pretty much anything. But that's it for now, and see you next time.